economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in the first hour talking with our good friend Ken Ham and really focusing on what is happening in the millennial generation. If you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we really have tried to develop various outreaches, and we've also expressed quite a bit of concern about the lack of orthodoxy and orthopraxy in this particular generation. So we're going to focus on some of that. A little bit later, we'll get into some of the news items, and before the program is over today in the second hour, we have Dr. Ben Carson with us, and I know we've got a lot to talk with him about as well. Many individuals that we've seen growing up in the church decide to take a break from church, almost 70%. Now, some come back to church, but a lot of them do not. And if you listen to this program, you know that all the way back, I think it was in 2009, we talked with Ken Ham and Britt Beamer about their book, Already Gone, and then followed up with Already Compromised. This third book is kind of the end of a trilogy, Ready to Return, bringing back the church's lost generation. Ken Ham, as you well know, is the president and founder of Answers in Genesis. We certainly appreciate the good work that they do, and we oftentimes send you to answersingenesis.org. Those of you that have been to the Creation Museum are even more excited about the upcoming Ark Encounter. And Ken Ham, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Kerby. Great to be with you again.
For our listeners that maybe are new, since we picked up stations since 2009, obviously, going all the way back, you and Britt Beamer were on the program talking about Already Gone, and I think that book had such a profound impact on a lot of us, because we realize it isn't that when the kids go off to college or they go into the military or they go out into the job world that they lose their faith. A lot of them are already sort of spiritually gone, even in middle school.
That's correct. In fact, what we did back then, Britt Beamer with America's Research Group did some research for us based on, research that had already been done by Barna and Lifeway, and there are others, that around, two-thirds of young people are leaving the church by the time they reach college age, and very few returning. And so that's the millennials that basically have left the church. And the research we did was, why have you left the church? When did this start to happen? What caused you, to reject the Bible, to reject Christianity, and so on? And really, what we found out was that they were starting to doubt the Bible at a young age, about 40% by the end of middle school, 45% by the end of high school. And so we realized that these people are starting to doubt God's Word right from a very young age. And one of the major reasons that we found out that was happening was because there are lots of questions leveled really at the Bible being an authority you can trust. And these days, we live in a so-called scientific age, and so people have this idea that science has shown the Bible's an outdated book, a book of mythology, and these young people have all sorts of questions. Well, how do you know the Bible's true, and where did God come from, and has science really disproved the Bible, and how can we really trust God's Word, and why do bad things happen? And how can we explain these sorts of things if there's a loving God? And we found out that a lot of churches, a lot of homes are not really teaching apologetics. They're not teaching a defense of the faith. They're not equipping young people with how to answer the skeptical questions of this age. And because of what they're being taught at public school and other places, it's causing them to doubt the Bible, and that doubt leads to unbelief, and they walk away from the church. And so a lot of churches have actually realized the importance of teaching apologetics, teaching a logical reasoned defense of the faith to the coming generations so that they will stand firm on the Word of God.
Well, and also let's, if we can, add something else that you have helped us understand, and that is the way we even teach the Bible when we're in a Sunday school class. Let's talk about those little guys there, maybe in grade school. We talk about Bible stories, and you have admonished us not to use that because the word stories to a child mean not historical. They're a nice fairy tale story, but they aren't true history.
You're right, Kerby. And, I was just talking at a pastor's conference, actually, here at the Creation Museum right before our interview, and I said to these pastors, what does the word story mean today? And so here we have all these pastors from different denominations, and they yelled out words like fable, fiction, not true, made up. And I said, exactly. And yet here we are, we say in our churches often, and in our Sunday schools, we say to kids, let's have a Bible story. We're going to have another Bible story. I said, the trouble is the word story has sort of changed meaning in our modern vernacular, and the word story to many people today means fiction. It's not true. And yet these kids will go to public school or watch TV, PBS channel, Learning Channel, or whatever it is, and they get the idea, we'll learn real stuff from TV, real stuff from school. What do we do at church? Well, we have stories. And I encourage them that they need to drop using the word story today and start to talk about when we're looking at the Bible, let's read this account of, let's read this record of. In other words, to emphasize it's a book of history, because Christianity is based in real history, and it's a history you can trust. And that's really what's happened in this day and age. The Bible has been attacked as a book of history. It's just a book of stories. It's not a book of history. We have to help the generations that we're training up to understand it is a book of history. I mean, think about even the message of the resurrection. Christ's birth, death, resurrection happened in real history. The reason that Jesus died on the cross for our sin is because there was a real rebellion with Adam and Eve. It was real history. And so it's really important to emphasize that in this day and age.
Well, and also one more connection I'd like to make, and that is if you don't believe that the Bible is true and historically accurate, then downstream you see some of the other things that have surfaced in your earlier studies as well as this book, Ready to Return, and that is they also then don't believe that homosexuality is wrong. They don't believe that sex outside of marriage is wrong. They don't believe that abortion should be illegal, but should be at least legal in some circumstances. So it isn't just their orthodox view about the Bible or Jesus Christ or whether or not there's one way to heaven, all of which, of course, up for grabs, especially in the younger generation, but then it impacts all sorts of social issues that we talk about here on Point of View.
Oh, very much so. I mean, think about the issue of marriage, because that's a big one in our culture right now. I mean, if the history in Genesis is not true, then how do you define marriage? I mean, what do we do with marriage? In Matthew 19, when Jesus was asked about marriage, he said, haven't you read he made them at the beginning male and female? And by the way, that's another issue today, gender distinction. I mean, Jesus gives gender distinction, male and female, right from the beginning, and he says, when a man leaves his father and mother and you cleave unto your wife and you be one flesh, based on the fact that the woman came from the man. Even in Corinthians, Paul talks about the woman is of the man. And so the doctrine of marriage is based there upon the literal history in Genesis. But if that history is not true, if there was no literal Adam and Eve, then what is marriage? Why is it to be a man and a woman? It's only a man and a woman because God invented marriage, and he invented marriage when he made the first marriage, Adam and Eve, Adam from dust and woman from his side. And, and even think about the issue of clothing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the origin of clothing is right there in Genesis. God gave coats of skins to Adam and Eve because of sin. Personally, I believe that was the first blood sacrifice as a covering for their sin, a picture of what was to come in Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Well, if you abandon Genesis, the literal history for marriage, and say marriage can be two men, two women, or whatever you want, well, why not abandon clothing? And, even in this nation right now, we see a movement. There's demonstrations with some women's groups in various parts of the country where they're saying, if men can take their tops off, why can't we? And why not? I mean, where do you draw the lines unless there's an absolute authority that says why not?
Very good. We're going to take a break and continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis. As we have said before, a very good book that deals with all those surveys is the one by Steve Cable that talks about cultural captive. But this new book really helps you understand where the church-attending millennials are. And when we come back, do they own the faith or are they just renting the faith? We'll talk about that with Ken Ham right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On the heels of a successful Christian film, War Room is another Christian film about faith, Woodlawn. I predict that this new film will do well as more people hear about it from word of mouth. The movie is a powerful story of what happened in the early 1970s at Woodlawn High School in Birmingham, Alabama. Racial conflict broke out because of government-mandated desegregation, and in the midst of all this, Hank brings a gospel message to the football team. More than 40 of them give their lives to Christ, and that changes the team and begins to change the high school and the community. The football team begins to make a run at the state playoffs, led in large part by their running back Tony Nathan, who later played for the University of Alabama and then for the Miami Dolphins. Not only is the dialogue realistic, the football scenes are realistic. Mark Ellis choreographed other movies like Any Given Sunday, Varsity Blues, and The Longest Yard, and was consulted on this film. The biblical message isn't blunted in this film either. The movie's tagline is One Hope, One Truth, One Way. This is obviously a reference to John 14:6. Key to the spiritual revival is the message Hank brings to the team after attending Expo 72 in Dallas and hearing a message by Billy Graham in the Cotton Bowl. I had Devon Franklin, President of Franklin Entertainment, in my radio studio to talk about the film. He plays the black preacher in the movie and was excited that the film is coming out at a time when racial tensions and violence are in the news. The revival that took place in Woodlawn shows how the gospel brought a level of racial unity to Birmingham, and we certainly need this message today. You know, we're blessed that we have a number of positive Christian films in the theaters. Now we need to go out and support them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Provident Films, Woodlawn, the true story of a spiritual awakening that saved a high school and shook a city. Woodlawn, in theaters now.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ken Ham with me for just a few more minutes. His book is entitled Ready to Return, Bringing Back the Church Lost Generation. About 200 pages, and you probably can find the book in your local bookstore. It's published by Master Books. But we also have a link, of course, to answersingenesis.org and information about the book on our website, pointofview.net. Ken, let's, if we can, maybe talk about the difference between owning your faith and renting it. I think all of us at one time or another maybe rented, and we maybe tried to take care of the apartment or house that we were renting, but that's very different than when you own it. And you use that same illustration of the difference between renters and owners. We really need to get everyone, especially young people, as we're talking about here, to own their faith.
Yes, and to own their faith, they really need to know why they believe what they do and know how to defend it. And that's one of the big problems that we have. And we found with the millennial generation, you know, in the church, but the millennials that are in the church, and this book where it talks about ready to return, we're talking about they need to return to a biblical foundation. They're the lost generation in that they've lost their biblical foundation. So they're all over the place theologically and in regard to their worldview. For instance, we found out that those millennials that are regularly attending churches right now, 40% of them say they're not born again. Then you've got 65% of them saying if you're a good person, you can go to heaven. And then you've got 40% of them who would say the possibility that there are other holy books other than the Bible, such as the Quran, for instance. They look on as an inspired book. And then you've got 40% of them who would not speak against gay marriage. In fact, 50% of them would not speak against gay marriage. So you have these millennials in our churches that have been very much affected by the world, that have a secular worldview, and they've got a facade of Christianity in a way, because they go to church, they're sitting in a church, attending our churches, but the majority of them do not understand the Christian faith. I mean, for 65% of them to say that if you're a good person, you'll go to heaven, I mean, the Bible makes it clear, unless man is born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. So they don't even understand the Christian faith. But many of them don't even understand what salvation is all about. So they don't own their faith. They don't really know what they believe. They don't really understand Christianity as they should. And these are the ones in our churches, which tells you there's a massive mission field right in our churches.
Yes.
And one of the things that I say to people is this: look, the 20s generation in our churches and the 20s generation in the culture, they're going to fundamentally change the church and culture in the future if we don't do something about it.
And I've said that before, the survey that Pro Ministries did a number of years ago, the Barna Research Group, of born-again millennials. They had to be born again to take it. So it's slightly different than your survey, but the same thing, because you work your way down to whether they have biblical beliefs, whether they have biblical practices, and whether they have a biblical worldview in terms of issues. And you can get yourself down to sometimes as small as 2%. And I said, even yesterday when I was with pastors in New Jersey, brothers and sisters, I mean, there's just no way that you have a church 20 years from now if only 2% actually believe it, act on it, and articulate biblical views. If you had a military that was only 2% effective, you'd want to do something else. If you had a business that was only 2% effective, and yet that's kind of where we are right now. As you said, when 2/3 of individuals in the church who are in the millennial generation believe that just a good person is all you need to go to heaven, well, that kills everything from evangelism to discipleship, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I mean, these people, by and large, the millennials speak a different language even. And I mean, it even goes deeper than that. For instance, generations ago, when we would go to the public schools and say the word God, most people would think of the God of the Bible. But you say the word God today in the public schools, and they say, which God? There are many gods. And, even these millennials that are sitting in our churches don't understand this. For many of them to say that even the Quran could be an inspired book, they don't even understand what the Bible is. They don't understand that it's the Word of God. And for these people that are so secularized, so evolutionized, I like to put it, by the culture, 85 to 90% of them go to public schools, and they're not out there impacting the culture for the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, if we stand back and look at the culture, let's face it, the church once impacted the culture in a big way. But what are we seeing now? We're seeing actually the culture that's impacting the church. It's the other way around. And we've got to recognize we're going to lose this culture totally from a Christian perspective if things keep going the way they are. Look at England. Look at the United Kingdom. Look across Europe.
Yes.
Church buildings everywhere turned into mosques and antique stores and shopping centers. In England, one of the statistics I saw when Penguin Books did a survey, they said 2/3 of teenagers don't even believe in God. They just totally reject that there's a God. That's where we're heading. And even recently in America, the Pew organization did a survey, and they said America is becoming less Christian mainly because, and their statement was, the millennials are leaving the fold. And these millennials that are in our churches now, they're going to be the millennials in the culture in the future that have left the fold. At Kerby, we actually did a survey earlier this year for our Ark project. We're building a life-size Noah's Ark that's going to open next year in 2016. It'll be one of the greatest Christian attractions of our era, we believe. And we had America's Research Group go out and find out how many people are going to come to the Ark. And by the way, it's around 2 million people a year. It's going to be an incredible outreach. But we also had them ask the spiritual state of the culture as well. This is a general population survey. And here's the interesting thing. What they found was this. When they asked, if you used to go to church regularly as kids, do you still go to church or have you stopped attending? The 60s generation, for instance, 22% stopped attending. But the 20s generation, it's 53% that have stopped attending. I mean, you see the incredible decline right there now before our very eyes. Those millennials that are going to church right now, they're going to be in that same group in years to come, stopped attending church. So we're losing those coming generations. And really we're at a tipping point in this nation. And it only takes one generation to lose a culture. I believe we're right at that tipping point in a big way right now.
Well, my last question for you, it's out of chapter 8. Are we already too late? Because there are certainly some people that have said, yes, I think we've lost the generation, we've lost the culture, and we'll just sit back and hope that Jesus returns soon. But you're not raising the red flag or the white flag, neither am I.
No, not at all. And I think we've got to remember that parable that Jesus taught when he entrusted resources to people, and then he said, do business till I come. And so I've had people say to me, isn't this just depressing? What's the point? That culture's being overtaken from a secular perspective. And my answer is, we have to do business till he comes. And what does that business mean? It means proclaiming the gospel, making disciples. It means giving answers, 1 Peter 3:15, being able to defend the Christian faith. And Jude, go out and contend for the faith. And we just need to be faithful because, we could just sit back and do nothing, but that's not what God's Word tells us to do. We need to be on about the business of the King, and the business of the King is reaching lives for the Lord Jesus Christ. So we do that through the Ministry of Answers in Genesis, the Creation Museum, the Life-Size Ark, the materials we produce, like this new book right here, to help waken people up. We just go out and do the best we can to get the message of the truth of God's Word and the gospel out to this culture and equip people to defend the Christian faith.
Let me again encourage you that if you're anywhere near Kentucky, first of all, go and see this wonderful Creation Museum. And, of course, you have the upcoming Ark Encounter. But also let me commend to you some of these books. Already Gone helps you understand why maybe you need to rethink what you do in youth ministry. Already Compromised really helps you challenge some of the mindset that says, well, I'll just send my kids to a Christian college. Some of them aren't all that Christian in terms of Christian worldview. And this new book, Ready to Return, really gives you the clear information about where we are, but also some very concrete steps we need to take in order to bring back the church's lost generation. And, of course, you can find so much of that at answersingenesis.org, and we have a link to that as well. Ken Ham, we always appreciate you being on the program with us.
Hey, thank you, Kerby. Anytime.
Let's take a break, but when we come back, even though Ken has to go on, I suspect some of you might actually want to comment on this issue, and there's a couple of ways in which you can do so. One of those, of course, is we talked about that book, Already Gone. That came out in 2009, Already Compromised in 2011, and both of those had some very important points that I think undergird and provide a foundation for this book, Ready to Return. And one of those is that oftentimes young people have already sort of checked out mentally in the church, and that I think requires us to come back and consider how we do church and how we communicate that. And there's some very concrete suggestions that he has given over the years in that regard. Already Compromised, recognize that a lot of so-called Christian universities aren't all that Christian sometimes, and so buyer beware. Just because that particular church-related school or Christian university, Christian college opens in prayer, has chapel service, doesn't mean they're really teaching from a Christian worldview. And, of course, this one, Ready to Return, again, I would commend this book to you if you want to understand what's in the minds and hearts of those who are even sometimes born-again millennials in the church, but he, of course, points out that a fair number of them did not consider themselves born again, so that's a problem. And again, I mentioned the book by Steve Cable, Cultural Captives, and we have that information on our website as well if you want to understand all those surveys, whether it's Christian Smith or Baylor or the Pew Survey or many of the others. But if you'd like to join our conversation, I have a lot to talk about today in the news, but if any of this is something you'd like to comment on, 1-800-351-1212. What are we doing to actually return some of these individuals back to church and keep those in church? We'll be right back.
This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary and click the Take Action link to make a difference in the world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, and easily contact us with your comments or questions. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the Point of View radio app. And one more thing, if you like it, click that button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app, with you on the go.
From PureFlix Entertainment and Provident Films comes Woodlawn. Witness the true story of a spiritual awakening that saved a high school and shook a city.
I'm asking you right now to stand up and make a decision.
Woodlawn. Experience one hope, one truth, and one way. Starring Academy Award winner Jon Voight and Sean Astin. Woodlawn. In theaters now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you join us, 1-800-351-1212. Spend a little bit of time talking about apologetics, how to defend the Christian faith, and also, of course, the trends among millennials. Ken Ham's book, Ready to Return, is one that I would commend to you. And, of course, I mentioned Steve Cable's book, Captive Christians. But let's, if we can, get some phone calls. We'll head out to Ohio first. Levi, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, how you doing, Kerby?
Very good.
I just had a quick question. A lot of the books you guys were mentioning are, written generally by Christian authors. And whenever I bring literature to people, secular people that I know and are having a hard time even making sense of the Bible, they immediately discount literature from Christian authors, saying, "Oh, well, it's biased and whatnot." I'm wondering if there's any resources or any books written, with the maybe the artifacts found revolving around stories in the Bible, written by somebody who wasn't a believer at the time and maybe was like, well, there's more to this now.
Very good. And let me give you a short list. There are a number of individuals. Let's take the easy category first, of those who are skeptics who really set out to disprove the Bible. And you have... of course, some in the past that aren't as well known, but some of the more recent ones, certainly Josh McDowell fits into that category because he really wanted to try to disprove the Bible. Lee Strobel, his book, Case for Christ and Case for Faith. I mean, in Case for Faith, or Case for Christ, I guess is the first book, he really talks about the fact that he was a real skeptical, atheistic journalist. J. Warner Wallace, we just had him on the program the other day, fits into that category. You can go down a pretty good list very quickly of individuals who were very secular, very skeptical, and really, in a sense, set out to disprove Christianity. Now, if you go back in history a little bit, of course, then you get into, of course, C.S. Lewis, I think could certainly fit into that category. Or Morrison's book, on the resurrection. I mean, there's some of those kind. But then if they say, well, no, I want somebody who's not a Christian now, but gives us evidence for Christian conclusions, well, by the time you get into, you mentioned archaeology. I've quoted Nelson Gluck, who's Jewish, on this program before. That would be a category. But especially with this issue of intelligent design, I'd have to say that a fair number of the individuals that have surfaced the data in the area of intelligent design are not Christians, or they're not Orthodox Christians. I mean, some of these individuals, they could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church, yet they will admit that there's lots of evidence for designer, there's evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe and those kinds of things. So I think there's a pretty long list, and maybe what we could do sometime is bring on somebody that has maybe studied this a little bit more, certainly Frank Turek or J. Warner Wallace or somebody like that, and see if they could, maybe even create a list that we could put on our Facebook page of books that are pretty secular, but nevertheless come to Christian conclusions. And especially in this area of intelligent design, some of it in archaeology, but also some just in terms of biblical authority. You have some individuals who, as I said, would not be able to sign the doctrinal statement of your church, but nevertheless have to conclude that the Orthodox view of history, of origins, of whatever it might be, is indeed accurate. So that's just a quick survey, but maybe we can follow up with that and provide some resources for you.
Excellent. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you calling in. It's a good question. And it deserves an opportunity to point out that individuals who aren't necessarily sympathetic to the gospel, nevertheless, will have to say, well, this archaeological find certainly confirms what we find in the Bible. And you have lots of those kinds of things. You certainly have a number of scientists that have talked about intelligent design that aren't Christian, or else they're really not Orthodox Christians. They may be Christian in the broadest sense of the word, and that maybe they've gone to church a few times, or maybe they even went through a catechism, but they're not real regular churchgoers or something like that. So that's some really good material, and I appreciate your phone call. Let's head out to Maine, WSEW. Barbara, thank you for calling today. What's your comment?
My comment is a lot of the liberal churches are not teaching biblical principles. They are teaching feelings, quote, feelings, unquote. They want to make the parishioner feel good about themselves. So the average, quote, Christian does not understand biblical principles.
Yes. And again, I would point out that that in some respects is where the culture has influenced the church, because I have said before that if you were to have followed me into the classroom, I don't do much speaking in college campuses much anymore because I'm doing radio every day, although I did take a short break and I went up to New Jersey this last weekend and then spoke to some pastors. Well, spoken to church Saturday and Sunday, and then spoken to a pastor's group on Monday. But if you were to have followed me in the old days, in the 70s and 80s, and even sometimes the early 90s, you'd hear students say, well, I don't think. Now the students say, I don't feel. And once you get into I don't feel, then that allows for political correctness, because I don't feel that's right, or I feel that's intolerant. I feel that's maybe not appropriate for us to talk about that. And so that's, I think, a good example where the culture churches pretty much buy into the culture anyway, and as a result, feelings can't be objectified. You may have one set of feelings, I have a different set of feelings, but we can't even come to a conclusion about what's true, because if you feel it's true for you, well, then I guess it's true for you. And if I feel something else is true, and so that gets us into postmodernism, and of course, that's exactly what a lot of these liberal churches have done. And that's why most of these liberal churches are dying, because a lot of people say, why do I go to church if nobody really believes this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I look around and I see, and I've been in the presence of people with white hair, and it's amazing to me what they believe. I heard one recently say that maybe evolution is good, is true. I wanted to, I just sat there. I did not defend God. I did not defend what I know to be true. But he heard me. He knows. He knows.
Well, you had a good testimony there. Barbara, appreciate your phone call. Let me see if I can just get a few more of these phone calls in. We've got some things to talk about that have happened in the news. So let's head out to Arizona this time, KNLB. Dwayne, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. You always have a good show. The gentleman that wanted evidence from a secular perspective, there's a movie called The Principle Movie. And it is the secular scientific work that proves that the earth is the center of everything.
Well, and I would add to that probably one that would be very easy to obtain, and that would be those various films produced by Illustra Media, The Privileged Planet. Now, I'll be fair to say that the book was written by Guillermo Gonzalez, who used to be a professor at Iowa State. Now he's at Grove City College, and also another individual, Jay Richards, who's at Discovery Institute. But most of the people in that film that are interviewed are secular people. They're astrophysicists, they're astronomers. And so, again, you could just see what the astronomers are saying in that particular film, and that would probably give you some pieces of evidence there as well. So one thing I'd recommend to Levi or some of the others, just go to Illustra Media. We've talked about a few of those before, and there are so many well-done films. And, again, some of the principles that kind of carry the dialogue sometimes have a Christian conviction, but, again, they have academic credentials that are equal to, if not superior to, some of the individuals that are being interviewed. And you can have a chance to hear from individuals who obviously, as I said before, could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church, but nevertheless, I think could certainly provide a little more of that secular perspective. Let's take one more very quickly. Leon in Illinois, thank you for calling today.
My name is Louis. I'm from Illinois.
Oh, Louis, okay.
Sad to say, the churches, let's agree what she said about this issue on evolution. It is crept in the church, sad to say. And I agree what she said. The church is buying into that. That's against Scripture.
Yep, and that's why we are talking about these issues, because we have to recognize that we need a responsibility on the part of churches and church leaders as well as responsibility on parents and grandparents that hear this program to make sure that we pass on the spiritual baton, if you will, just like a track meet. I've oftentimes said that if it's misty in the pulpit, it's foggy in the pews. And that is, if we don't clearly communicate the gospel and do not clearly communicate a biblical worldview from the pulpit, or also from our Sunday school teachers to the individuals, then they're going to have a mixed up kind of theology. And the same thing about parents. If around the dinner table we aren't communicating the Word of God and encouraging them to know what they believe and why they believe it, we're going to have the very problems Ken Ham talked about. So that's why we talk about it so often here on Point of View, and that's why I commend to you this new book, Ready to Return, by Ken Ham. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Next hour, we're going to have Ben Carson with us, so that'll give us a chance to hear from him. And I might give one or two of you a chance to ask him a question if you'd like to do so. That's one of the things that we like to provide to those of you that listen to this program on a regular basis. And by the way, if you listen to this program on a regular basis, you know that there are a couple of things that always bother me about talk shows, and I've tried to avoid those here. One of those is that sometimes you talk about an issue, and then we never talk about it again. And people go, well, what happened to that issue? And that's a problem not only with talk shows, it's really a problem with a lot of local television programs. They cover a story, and then you go, well, what happened? You know, did that person get out of jail? What happened to this individual that had this financial need? And sometimes they never cover it. So I want to cover a story or two that we talked about on Friday, which leads me to my second criticism sometimes of other talk shows, and that is we never tell people enough about what was just talked about. You know, not only do I do a talk show, I listen to talk shows, and sometimes I tune in, and this host will be talking for some time, and I'm going, what are you talking about? You haven't refocused the program and talked about what we just dealt with and helped me understand, because I happened to just tune in at that point, what the conversation is all about. So I want to do both of those. For those of you that were listening Friday, you might remember we were talking about an individual who is a coach at Bremerton High School, which is in Washington State, I should say, Joe Kennedy. And he was told that he could not go to the 50-yard line like he has always done after the game and pray. So some of you, of course, wondered, well, what happened? Well, let me read a little bit from Rachel Alexander. Last Friday night, with the law on his side, Coach Joe Kennedy resumed his prayer after the game on the 50-yard line to the cheers of hundreds who showed up to support him, including, I love this part, the opposing team, which surprised him by joining him for prayer. Now, if you are right now watching the Woodlawn movie, and I did my commentary today on Woodlawn, or if you go all the way back, Woodlawn was done by the Irwin brothers, or you go back to the Kendrick brothers that did Facing the Giants, this is where the idea came from, to go to the center of the field after the game is over and pray. And for a while he did it by himself, and then some of the football players said, Coach, what are you doing? Well, I'm praying. What are you praying about? Well, I'm thanking God for the game, and I'm thanking God that you had played a good game, or we won, or we lost, or you know, that you were safe, or whatever. And so they started joining him, and that's when in Bremerton, Washington, everybody began to say, wait a minute, this is not constitutional. Well, first of all, he did indeed go back to the 50-yard line. Hundreds cheered him. Both his team and the opposing team joined him. So I thought you might like to know a little bit more about that story. And I think Rachel Alexander talks about the fact that some have said, well, you can't do that because the Supreme Court ruled in this case called Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe that the students who were actually praying over the loudspeaker system at the football games was unconstitutional. Well, first of all, she points out rightly that the court based its decision on the fact that the prayer was done using the school's equipment, and the loudspeaker system in particular, as well as the fact that everyone attending the game was essentially required to hear it. I still think the court ruled incorrectly in that, but we'll leave that to the court in another day. Because if you look in the actual opinion, it's really bizarre, because they're really wanting to have a separation of player and prayer. And they said you cannot have a prayer before a Texas high school football game because a Texas high school football game is not a religious event. They've never been to a Texas high school football game. I mean, sometimes it's a real religious event for some people, but nevertheless, joking aside, this is a situation which is right now in Bremerton boiling over. And our good friends with Liberty Institute have been defending Coach Joe Kennedy, and we'll see where that goes after this. Hiram Sasser has been on this program with us before with Liberty Institute, said, quote, the appropriate solution is the school should make the audience know that Coach Kennedy is doing this with a team in their private capacity. The solution is not to squelch your banned speech, simply to explain it is private speech. And that makes a lot more sense than trying to cut it off. But I did want to come back to that and say that Coach Joe Kennedy went out to the 50-yard line and prayed, and we'll spend some time probably on this Friday's weekend edition talking a little bit more about what has happened, any repercussions, and what Liberty Institute may or may not do in that regard. But once again, thought you would like to know about that, since that is something we talked about last Friday. One of the other stories we talked about is the clock boy. Remember him? Ahmed Mohammed brought a clock to school and got himself in trouble. And that led, interestingly enough, to this tweet that came from the President of the United States. President Obama said, cool clock, Ahmad. Want to bring it to the White House? We should inspire more kids like you to like science. It's what makes America great. So he actually invited him to bring his clock to the White House. Well, a lot of people have been having some fun with this, pointing out He didn't bring the clock to the White House. Is there a reason for that? Yes, because I think Secret Service would have a real problem bringing that particular device in, wondering if, because it looks so much like a suitcase bomb, whether or not it might indeed really be that. And so there were all sorts of statements being made. Even the White House press secretary, Josh Earnest, said, "I'm not aware of his plans to bring the clock." You think? I mean, this is, again, I think, a vindication for the high school who were saying, first of all, he was told, take the clock home or set it aside or put it in your locker. He wouldn't do any of that. And then later on, it goes off, ring, in one of the other class, I think it was the English class. And after a while, he was being very evasive, and it's almost like it was a test run to see how the school would respond to it. And if you don't think that there maybe was a secondary agenda, even some of the news reports pointed out how Ahmad Mohammed, the clock boy, has become rather controversial because he's been, he left, of course, from the Dallas area, went to San Francisco. He's been to, of course, now Washington, D.C. For their astronomy night there at the White House. But he also went just a few days ago and was pictured with Sudanese president and war criminal Omar al-Bashir. He's wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of genocide and war crimes for atrocities linked to the Darfur fighting. So again, might want to follow a little bit more on that story, but I thought you'd like to know a little bit about the clock boy. And in the second hour, just before we talk with Ben Carson, if you have a comment about the coach praying, Joe Kennedy, or about the individual, Ahmad Mohammed, and his clock, we'd certainly welcome your phone calls. And one other one I thought I would mention, we've been following for some time, Planned Parenthood and the Center for Medical Progress videos. Well, now, if you look at even the John Stone Street commentary today, now Planned Parenthood decided that it will no longer charge for those resources. And so as a result, they've changed the plans. And the argument, I think, is going to be that, well, now we aren't getting money for it. So after all, that eliminates all of the concern. But, of course, we've pointed out that some of the other concerns are just the way in which they were harvesting that fetal tissue in the first place, the way they were not getting consent, and whether or not our tax dollars should go for it in the first place. So we see that, and even in the state of Texas now, a decision that Medicaid will not actually fund Planned Parenthood. So this story, as I've said before, has legs, and it will continue for some time. But we need to take a break. When we come back, lots of other stories to cover first, including some people that are suggesting that maybe there could be a Trump-Carson ticket. Also, of course, a number of individuals from Ben Carson to Mike Huckabee, Jeb Bush, Ted Cruz, Rick Santorum, Carly Fiorina were at Prestonwood Baptist Church this last Sunday, interviewed by Jack Graham, the pastor there, and that was an opportunity to educate people who were there, 6,000, as well as other people watching online about the faith commitment of some of these candidates. And, of course, that's an important issue that we'll talk about in this second hour with Dr. Ben Carson. So we'll take a break. If you'd like to find some of the information about not only the book by Ken Ham, but this book we'll talk about with Ben Carson, you can find that at our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we have some other resources for you to find there as well. So go to pointofview.net during the break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 855-87-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 855-87-BIBLE. That's 855-87-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Second hour today, and a little bit later this hour, we'll be talking with Dr. Ben Carson. He's got a new book out, A More Perfect Union, What We, the People, Can Do to Reclaim Our Constitutional Liberties. And if you want to kind of do Constitution 101 and understand the importance of the Constitution and how we can reclaim those liberties, I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation with him. Of course, we'll talk about his campaign a little bit, but it's such a good book. I don't want to take too much away from the campaign, so we'll talk about that before he gets on. And, of course, give you a chance to join the conversation as well. In the previous hour, though, we did talk about a couple of issues, and if any of those still strike you, you're welcome to join us. We talked with Ken Ham, for example, about his latest book, which is Ready to Return, and it talks about the importance of really teaching biblical worldview and helping individuals, especially the millennial generation, know what they believe and to know how to defend that. Then, of course, we've talked about the clock boy going to the White House during astronomy night and didn't bring his clock. And, of course, I also gave you an update on Coach Joe Kennedy up there in the state of Washington and also Planned Parenthood. This hour, we probably won't get into it, but I think for those of you listening from Canada or those of you that used to live in Canada, we saw a remarkable change there in the leadership, and that some people wonder if what happened in Canada will happen here, and that is where Justin Trudeau won, but earlier the Pierre Trudeau was his father. But anyway, the Liberal won over the Conservative. I won't get into all the details right now. Stephen Harper exits the scene. He was the Conservative, and some people said, well, does that say maybe we're getting more liberal? Well, that's one idea. Or is it that people like a brand name like Trudeau? Well, I think those are possibilities, but I think the biggest possibility simply goes back to the fact that the price of oil dropped precipitously, and that hurt the Canadian economy even more than it has hurt the economy here in the United States. And so I think that may be an explanation for some of that. Of course, also, we'll get into this a little bit closer to the Star Wars movie, but Star Wars The Force Awakens, the ticket sales crashed all these different websites, which shows the tremendous hunger for Star Wars and some of the science fiction movies that are out there as well. So we're going to talk with Ben Carson in just a little bit, but I thought we would do that where we give you kind of a run-up to some of this. And I think for especially a Ben Carson or a Ted Cruz or some of these others, they believe that a real important key, first to their nomination, then to their election as president, is going to be the Christian vote. And if you've listened to this program any length of time or even saw my commentary that came out on October 12th, I pointed out that when we did the interview that day before, the week before, with Gary Frazier and George Barna, that we found some very disturbing trends. And one of those is that there were 39 million eligible Christian voters who did not vote or were not registered to vote last time. That breaks down that, if you want to write this down, take out a piece of paper and a pencil or pen or something like that, write down the number 39, and 39 million are the number of individuals who are self-identified born-again Christians who did not vote last time. And of that 39 million, it breaks down to one-third, two-thirds. One-third, that is 13 million of them, were not registered to vote. And then two-thirds, or 26 million, were registered but did not go to the polls. Now, the key to an election of a Ted Cruz, and even in the nomination, he believes, is to get a turnout of the Christian vote. individuals that did not turn out even in the primary needs to turn out for him to be successful. And it's not by accident that he actually announced his candidacy at Liberty University, and certainly has been dependent upon getting Christians to the polls, first in the primary and then in the electoral college vote as well, because of what you do when you vote for the president. You essentially do not vote directly for him or her. You vote for the electors that go from that state. And so I think it is also indicating a little bit of the importance of the Christian vote when we look at the fact that what happened in terms of really trying to mobilize the Christian vote. And that is at Prestonwood Baptist Church, Pastor Jack Graham actually put together an opportunity for individuals to come to the sanctuary, 6,000 there, or to watch online the various question and answer and interview and remarks from the various candidates. And that would be the two governors, Jeb Bush and Mike Huckabee, and then the two senators, or in one case former senator, Ted Cruz and Rick Santorum, and then the two, if you will, sort of outsiders, Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina. By the way, you might say, well, why were they invited? Well, everybody was invited, and it's quite possible, even up until the 11th hour, that some people thought maybe Bernie Sanders would show up. I mean, after all, remember, Bernie Sanders did go to Liberty University, and he's willing to go into any venue and see if he can attract votes. And so he might have been there. Hillary Clinton could have been there. Ted Cruz obviously was there, but you could have had all sorts of other individuals that would have been there. Donald Trump could have been there. But nevertheless, to these individuals, this has an opportunity for them to make a statement and then to have some counterpoint in kind of quiet but still somewhat pointed conversations about this particular issue and what those were. Many people said that Senator Ted Cruz kind of enjoyed a home field advantage, not only as a native Texan, but also, of course, as a pastor's son. And, of course, he also got quite a number of ovations. And he told individuals, I was proud to lead the fight against Planned Parenthood. He says, you look to the other folks, where are they? How different would it have been if 11 Republican presidential candidates descended on Washington and spoke in unison and said, don't send $500 million of tax money to Planned Parenthood. And, of course, there were a number of other opportunities there as well. But I found that most people said that they could probably have voted for any of those candidates. Some people put a little asterisk on maybe Carly Fiorina, but this was an opportunity once again to get into the importance of the Christian vote. And as I've pointed out before, it's going to be absolutely key. And if those 39 million that stayed home last time stay home again, then I think we have a pretty good idea that whoever the Democratic nominee is, and most likely that at this point looks like it will be Hillary Clinton, will be elected. And so this is why you have various organizations that we talked about with Gary Frazier and George Barna, one in particular called United in Purpose, that are working really hard to identify Christians who did not vote but have biblical values. And they've put together these massive databases, some of this funded by people in Silicon Valley, where they can identify somebody that maybe didn't vote but subscribes to, say, World Magazine, or actually has sent money to American Family Association or something else, and to go back then and encourage them to pledge that they would vote in the next election and to follow them up and to get them to the polls. So we're going to see how important that Christian vote will be. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about some of the articles we've posted on the website today. First of all, could we have a Trump-Carson ticket? Second of all, the just enormous amount of money that actually Ben Carson has been able to raise for his campaign. That's been a liability in the past. It is not much of a liability now. And then just a short piece by our friend Pat Buchanan, can Trump be stopped? Will we have Trump as the nominee, or is there a possibility that someone else might be the Republican standard bearer? So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll also take your phone calls. If you have some thoughts about Donald Trump, Ben Carson, about the Christian vote, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On the heels of a successful Christian film, War Room is another Christian film about faith, Woodlawn. I predict that this new film will do well as more people hear about it from word of mouth. The movie is a powerful story of what happened in the early 1970s at Woodlawn High School in Birmingham, Alabama. Racial conflict broke out because of government-mandated desegregation, and in the midst of all this, Hank brings a gospel message to the football team. More than 40 of them give their lives to Christ, and that changes the team and begins to change the high school and the community. The football team begins to make a run at the state playoffs, led in large part by their running back Tony Nathan, who later played for the University of Alabama and then for the Miami Dolphins. Not only is the dialogue realistic, the football scenes are realistic. Mark Ellis choreographed other movies like Any Given Sunday, Varsity Blues, and The Longest Yard, and was consulted on this film. The biblical message isn't blunted in this film either. The movie's tagline is One Hope, One Truth, One Way. This is obviously a reference to John 14:6. Key to the spiritual revival is the message Hank brings to the team after attending Expo 72 in Dallas and hearing a message by Billy Graham in the Cotton Bowl. I had Devon Franklin, president of Franklin Entertainment, in my radio studio to talk about the film. He plays the black preacher in the movie and was excited that the film is coming out at a time when racial tensions and violence are in the news. The revival that took place in Woodlawn shows how the gospel brought a level of racial unity to Birmingham, and we certainly need this message today. You know, we're blessed that we have a number of positive Christian films in the theaters. Now we need to go out and support them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Provident Films, Woodlawn, the true story of a spiritual awakening that saved a high school and shook a city. Woodlawn, in theaters now.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just before I take some of the phone calls, let me just mention that one of the articles we've posted here by Sandy Fitzgerald, I think it's really interesting. Donald Trump said that he and fellow GOP presidential contender Ben Carson have hit a chord with voters, but it's still way too early to say if there will be a Trump-Carson ticket in next year's general election. But he did tell on CNN's New Day program, we have a very good relationship and we're not as different as people might think. He says we certainly have a different style. You know, I have great assets and he has great assets, but we are both resonating and there's no question about it. Because the newest poll that has come out, and that's the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, listed Trump at 25%, Carson at 22%. You have a different one where you have a CNN ORC poll, and that put Trump at 27%, Carson at 22%. If you take that first one, they're sort of within the range of error, within the confidence level. So just assuming that that is the case and that there aren't too many overlaps, if you took 22% and 25%, you have 47%. I mean, you already say the two of them collectively almost have half of the votes from the Republican voters. So something to think about a little bit. Donald Trump went on to say on CNN, I went up a little from my original. I've gone up a lot. And you know, the other candidates are similar. Maybe these polls are starting to accurate out. I usually think the word accurate is not a verb, but whatever. And then he goes, it's certainly interesting. He said so many people have suggested it because we seem to be doing awfully well. So that is a possibility, and most people would not have talked about that 6 months ago. I'm not sure they would have been talking about that 6 weeks ago, but now, as you can see, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, something very interesting, and that is some people seriously talking about a Trump-Carson ticket. And at least Donald Trump is talking about that. We'll see if Ben Carson has something to say about that as well. And then on this week of Sunday, of course, you had Donald Trump being asked questions. You also had, of course, Ben Carson. And in particular, the question that went to Ben Carson was about this idea of George W. Bush bearing some blame for the attacks on 9/11. I'm not going to get into that, although it even surfaced in that event there at Prestonwood, in which Pastor Jack Graham said, I just want to say one thing in passing, George W. Bush did keep us safe. But nevertheless, when Ben Carson was asked about that, he said, well, I would probably have to ask him what he meant by that. I seriously doubt that he's saying that George W. Bush is to blame for it. And there have been others that where he even on NBC News said he thought it was ridiculous to suggest George W. Bush bears any blame for the attacks. But the point I want to make before I take some phone calls here is these comments came in the midst of two big wins for Ben Carson. And the first is $20.7 million raised in the third quarter. Ben Carson raised the most of any Republican candidate in the field, and is successful, along with Donald Trump, number two, to get CNBC to commit to his request concerning the format of the upcoming debate. If you're not familiar with this, first of all, of course, Ben Carson raised more than any other Republican candidate. That's amazing. Number two, he and Donald Trump have said, we're not going to participate in this CNBC debate unless you change it, because you're using this, in a sense, to raise money, to bring in more ad revenue. And we want one that is not as long as the Democratic debate, number one. And number two, we also are not going to allow you to carry on the kind of debates that have taken place so far. And because the two of them have so much clout, we'll see. But I can't see how CNBC will not do anything except back down. And that leads to one other victory right now for Ben Carson, and that is he's become the first candidate to get on the ballot in the North Mariana Islands, the Virgin Islands, and Alabama. And that is why he is actually calling for what he calls a 56 jurisdiction strategy. That is, he wants to get on the ballot in all 50 states. Looks like he's going to do that. Plus 6 U.S. territories that would send delegates to the Republican National Convention. So, as they like to say, it's coming up roses for Ben Carson. Everything is coming his direction. And even though many of us have known him, had our picture taken with him, gotten to know him and his wife Candy a little bit, never would have predicted it. But Ben Carson is definitely on a roll, and that's even illustrated by the fact that Donald Trump is talking about the possibility there could be a Trump-Carson ticket, which I did not see coming either. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to, first of all, Georgia on the Good News Network. Clinton, thank you for calling today.
Hey, Kerby. I've called before, and I just have a question and a comment. One question would be, I'd like to see what would Dr. Carson's plan would be about the economy and about health care, because I'm a registered nurse, and I'd like to see what would if he becomes president, what would he like to do about the whole Obamacare deal? And what he's going to do about jumpstart the economy. And then number two, I just want to say, I've been impressed with Dr. Carson. I hope the Lord will bless him to be our next president. And I just pray the Lord to continue to bless him.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll tell him that a lot of us have been praying for him, and I know you are as well. On the issue of the economy, one of the things we have seen, and you can go to his own website, and we have links there so you can check it out yourself. He really believes that we have just an overburdensome government in terms of not only various bureaucracies, but regulations. Now, the bottom in the size and scope of government. Only really one time in recent history where that's taken place, and that was under Ronald Reagan. And that was a difficult thing to do. Of course, he didn't have quite what I think the Republicans might have in terms of it's possible, probably quite likely, that the Republicans will not only retain control of the Senate and the House, which, of course, Ronald Reagan had part of that. He did have a very slim Republican majority in the Senate for a while and then lost that. But still, it is so difficult to rein in the size and scope of government, but that's what needs to be done if we indeed want to stimulate the economy. Another would be to lower the corporate income tax, which is higher than, the other day you had Bernie Sanders saying, I want to be like Denmark. Well, Denmark has a lower corporate income tax than we do. Really, every other country in the world has a lower corporate income tax than we do. So maybe that would help. So there are some things that could be done there. In terms of health care, we would be in very good hands, and I use that as a illustration of one of his earlier ones about the gifted hands that he had, because here we have an individual that has been in the medical field for so long. And in some places, people might say, well, what do you know about government? Well, maybe not a whole lot, but he certainly has a sound mind. But when you would dare not ask, what do you know about medicine? He knows a lot about medicine and certainly could provide alternatives to the Affordable Care Act. He's already made it pretty clear when he was on the stage, and it was at the National Prayer Breakfast, talking about the fact that he believes that giving everybody a medical savings account is a much better way to go, and it would be a way to deregulate all sorts of things in the healthcare system right now that are perverted in many ways. There's just some perverse incentives right now with the Affordable Care Act, but also going all the way back to Medicare and Medicaid. So those are some things that I think he would possibly do. And if we have a chance, we'll ask him some of those questions in just a few minutes. Let me go to Tammy this time. Tammy, what would you like to ask?
Well, I would first like to say that Georgia is Carson country. Just organized 45 volunteers out at the Georgia National Fair, and he took the peanut pole. But I heard a lot of people say something about Trump Carson or Carson Trump. Would he be willing to be vice president? I don't think that's why he's running. I think he's running to be the leader, talking about Dr. Carson.
Yes, and it's kind of like the question that was asked, this was 8 years ago when somebody, I think it was David Letterman, was asking Barack Obama, well, would you be willing to be vice president? And he said, well, why be vice president? Maybe I could be president. Exactly. And at the time, everybody thought that Hillary was going to be the president, he'd be the vice president. Well, not exactly. I mean, we pretty much know what happens on the Democratic side. Hillary Clinton probably wins the nomination, and she'll probably pick Raul Castro as her vice president. Okay, so you've got a woman and Hispanic, former mayor of San Antonio, now works, of course, in the Obama administration. So what do you go up with that? Is that a Trump Fiorina? Is that a Trump Carson? Or is it a Carson Cruz or a Carson Fiorina or whatever? I don't think Donald Trump would take vice president. But those are all questions to be decided. So we'll have to see.
Right. I just, I'm not surprised that Trump says Trump Carson. I don't blame him, but I don't even like the thought of that. I'd rather see Carson somebody. But anyway, I'd love to know how we could pray for him. I know this has to be a very busy, stressful time for him. He's been out on the trail for a while, and I'd love to know how we could pray for him and just lift him up.
That's what we will do. He should join us shortly, unless he's got another limitation on his schedule. But if indeed everything works out, we should, in just a few minutes, be talking with Dr. Ben Carson. We'll be back right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 855-87-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 855-87-BIBLE. That's 855-87-BIBLE.
Take Kerby and the Truth Team with you wherever you go. You can listen, you can read, you can watch. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View radio app. Get it today, the Point of View radio app.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
And as we promised, we now have a chance to talk with Dr. Ben Carson. Before he joined us, of course, talked a little bit about the fact that he was able to raise more money than any other Republican candidate in the third quarter. Talked about his 56 jurisdiction strategy and all sorts of things coming up in a very positive way for Dr. Ben Carson, but also want to spend some time talking about his new book. If you're not familiar with him, of course, he was the director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University, author of all sorts of books, including One Nation, One Vote, America the Beautiful, The Gifted Hands. And of course, he and his wife Candy are the co-authors of this book, and they are the founders of Carson Scholars Fund. Dr. Carson, always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Well, thank you. Good to be back with you.
You know, on your book, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Of course, we'll back our way into the campaign. A More Perfect Union, What We the People Can Do to Reclaim Our Constitutional Liberties. And as I go through the book, it is really Constitution 101. And I like the fact that your argument is, and I think I agree with it, is the Constitution's not that hard to understand, and you don't have to go to graduate school, although some of us have, or you don't have to go to law school, as some of your fellow candidates have. It was written for the average American to read and understand and apply.
Correct. It was written at an 8th grade level, and it was meant that the people would actually understand the foundational document that established our nation. And, you know, it's only been in more recent years that people say, oh, you got to be a constitutional scholar to understand this. But, of course, those are the same people who say you have to be, you know, a lifetime politician to be able to solve problems. And we know that that's not true. You know, our system was designed for citizen statesmen, not for career politicians.
Well, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why you're running, and also one of the reasons why you're resonating, because as we look down the list, whether it's Donald Trump or Ben Carson or Carly Fiorina, those are individuals that have not served in government, or you have others that have been challenging the establishment. I'll put Ted Cruz in that category, maybe some others. So it seems to me that the voters right now are looking for someone who brings common sense to an understanding and interpretation of the Constitution.
Absolutely. And we have to understand that our Constitution was written to guarantee our liberties, but also to define the government and to restrict the government, because the natural tendency of governments is to expand and infiltrate and control. And it was intended by our founders that we would never reach that stage, although they warned that we might.
So again, it seems to me that if we get into the Constitution, let's talk about a couple of them. First Amendment, that is, you have a whole section here on the Bill of Rights, and we talk about First Amendment religious liberty issues so often. What should we know about that? Because if indeed the Constitution is relatively easy to understand, why is it we've had so many debates over things like the Establishment Clause? Why are we saying that, as we talked about last Friday, this coach, Joe Kennedy up in Washington, can't go to the 50-yard line after the football game is over and pray? What about that?
Well, that is a very big aberration. You know, in the several decades ago, the Supreme Court made a ruling in which we got the phrase separation of church and state. There is no such phrase in the Constitution, by the way.
And again,
allow people to have freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And we've completely gone away from that, and we've actually established a religion, and that
you talk about as well.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a divided government so that if one branch gets out of it, should have already had something ready to go to protect the religious freedoms of people so that they wouldn't lose their jobs that are going to continue to occur until, you know, somebody has the backbone to step up and create legislation that protects people's religious freedom.
You talk a little bit about the issue of medicine in the book, which would make sense because of your background. And you've talked about the fact that we should come up with an alternative. And just before you joined the program, we had some people saying, I'd love to know what Dr. Ben Carson, whose expertise is in medicine, would propose as an alternative to Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. And we don't see anything in the Constitution, and you only mention it in passing in the book. But that, of course, goes back to the very important presentation you gave at the National Prayer Breakfast. But is that a solution of various kinds of health insurances and various kinds of care acts and things of that nature, and letting people have a savings account?
Yeah, utilizing health savings accounts puts the care back in the hands of the patients and the healthcare providers, takes the middleman largely out of the equation. You would give people the ability to have a health savings account from the day they're born until the day they die, at which time it can be passed on to a family member. And we pay for it with the same dollars that we pay for traditional health care with. We spend a lot of dollars on health care in the country, by the way, about twice as much per capita as many other countries. So there's adequate resources. We just don't use it correctly. And you give people the ability to shift money within their health savings account, within their family. Which provides enormous flexibility to cover almost anything that comes up, which means that your catastrophic insurance is now going to be much, much cheaper, because the only thing coming out of that is going to be true catastrophic health issues. And how often do those come up? Not very often at all. And you make it possible to buy that across state lines, and the price drops even further. Now, that takes care of 75% of the people. It doesn't take care of the indigent because we don't have a mechanism for funding their HSA. However, we do have a mechanism. It's called Medicaid.
Yes.
And your Medicaid budget is $400 to $500 billion in aid to many. But we can remedy that by fixing what we have right now, $80 million into $400. Now, what could you buy with that? A concierge practice. Generally costs $2,000 to $3,000 a year. That's what rich people buy. And so you could put them all on one of those and still have thousands left over to buy their catastrophic insurance, which is much cheaper now. I'm not suggesting we can't do that because they're too stupid and they wouldn't be able to manage a health. More than it does in the clinic. They go to the clinic, get it taken care of, and then the clinic, instead of sending them out, they say, let's get your diabetes under control so you're not back here in 3 weeks with another major problem, a whole nother level of savings that we're not realizing right now. And you're teaching that person personal responsibility as opposed to dependency. They put a program out there like that, and nobody will want Obamacare, I guarantee you.
Well, it also gets back to the issue of transparency, because if indeed you put the power in the hands of the patient, the consumer, then you might actually know what it costs. I mean, I can walk into an electronics store and I can ask, what does that television cost, or what does that iPod cost, or whatever it might be. But I go into a hospital, and I've done this before, ask what it's going to cost, and they look at me like I've got four eyes, because they just are not used to that.
Yeah, and of course it brings transparency. They don't have to play the silly games that you play with the insurance companies anymore. And so you'll get both quality and cost control.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more. Probably would love to ask you about at least a Second Amendment issue, since that's been in the news as well, and then a little bit about the campaign. So again, we are talking today with Dr. Ben Carson, this new book out called A More Perfect Union, What We the People Can Do to Reclaim Our Constitutional Liberties. About 240 pages, and it is just a great introduction to the Constitution. If you've never studied that before, do not understand this issue of the Constitution, some of these constitutional issues, that is the case. And some people might say, well, okay, he's a doctor. Why is he writing about the Constitution? Well, the argument, I think, is a very powerful one. Constitution was written for all of us. We should be able to read it and interpret it ourselves. And some of the individuals that were in the first Supreme Court were individuals that were not lawyers, but they were individuals that had sound minds. They had an understanding of what indeed was meant by the words that were written down on the page. And so as a result, I think we need to come back to some of that. And I think it explains again why, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, even people talking about a Trump-Carson ticket or a Carson fee arena ticket. I mean, there are all sorts of people talking about various combinations, but interestingly enough, when they pick those individuals that they would like to run for office and actually support, it's amazing how many of them don't have a law degree and aren't necessarily individuals that have been part of the process of the government. So let's take a break. We'll come back and continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Ben Carson. His book, A More Perfect Union. We have information about him and the book on our website, pointofview.net.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Ben Carson with us for a few more minutes. The book is entitled Candy Carson, What We, the People, Can Do to Reclaim Our Constitutional Liberties. We talked a little bit about the First Amendment. How about the Second Amendment? If there's one thing where I could see a real striking difference between the Republican debates and the one Democratic debate, it's on the issue of the Second Amendment. And Dr. Carson, we're hearing more and more about we need common sense gun safety laws. And I don't know what that means, but what are your thoughts about how we interpret the Second Amendment?
Well, you have to first of all understand why it's there. It's there to make sure that the populace could aid the military in case of a foreign invasion, and also so that the populace could protect itself against an overly aggressive government if we ever had the wrong leaders in place. And both of those things are very, very important. And we need to start, using a little bit of common sense and sort of the hysteria that always surrounds any incident involving guns. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. And when you look at some of these mass shootings that have occurred, isn't it interesting that most of them occur in gun-free zones?
Yes.
Even though these people might be a little less than fully intact mentally, they're intact enough to recognize that, let me go to a place where I'm not likely to get shot.
Well, let's, if we can, maybe get into a couple of questions that people asked before you joined us. And I think Clinton and Georgia wanted to know, what about the economy? Obviously, the Constitution gives a limited role to the government, but I suggested that you would probably want to affect the economy and job creation by limiting the size and scope of government, maybe reducing the corporate income tax. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. What would you do to create jobs and to turn this economy around?
Yeah, well, recognize that we have the most powerful economic engine the world has ever known in this country. And it cannot function because it's fettered down by a gazillion regulations. That's a big problem. Each regulation costs in terms of goods and services, but who does that affect the most? Poor people and the middle class. And that's something that's not being talked about. The incredible debt that we have, the GDP to debt ratio. Many economists will tell you that once that reaches 90%, you get great sluggishness. That's what we've seen. From 1850 to 2000, the economy grew at a rate of 3.3% on average. From 2001 to 2014, it grew at a rate of 1.8%. Yes. That's a big difference in terms of what we're able to generate and what it does for the economy. And so if we get rid of those regulations, allow that to be scoped up, change the tax code so that we have something that is completely fair and doesn't advantage one group or another group one way or the other, I think you would see a great explosion. And that includes the corporate tax rate, which is the highest in the developed world. What I would do is lower it below the average so we suck things back in here. But first thing I would do is allow a 6-month hiatus, tax-free hiatus, to repatriate over $2 trillion that's sitting overseas, require that 10% of it be used in enterprise zones and to create jobs for people who are unemployed and on welfare. You want to talk about a stimulus. That would be the biggest stimulus since FDR's New Deal. It wouldn't cost the taxpayers one penny, and it would be a tremendous jumpstart.
Yeah, repatriate some of that. Since you mentioned taxes, let's, if we can, I'll go to Mike in South Carolina. I think you had a question for Dr. Carson about taxes. Yeah, go ahead.
My first question is on the fair tax. If you support the fairtax.org, or do you look at a whole other system? What's your opinion there?
Well, I'm actually having my economist cost out both the fair tax at various different rates and the flat tax with no loopholes and no deductions at various rates, so we can do a fair analysis and then present that to the people. Because I really want to see which one the people would want after they had all the information. But it would be one of those two, either a flat tax with no deductions, and that's going to be somewhere between 10 and 15%, or a fair tax, which is going to be somewhere between 15 and 23%, in order to be revenue neutral.
Let me go to Georgia real quickly. Tammy, I think you wanted to know how you could pray and how we could pray for Dr. Ben Carson.
Well, I would. Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would. I would like to know how we could pray for you, Dr. Carson. I know that it's been a tough time out on the trail. It has to be, and we would like to be able to pray for you as you're campaigning and traveling.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I believe it is those prayers that have sustained us so far. Pray for wisdom for the American people so that they can see through a lot of the subterfuge that's going on and a lot of the deceitfulness that is going on that's creating the problems that we have in our country, and pray for protection for me and my family. I appreciate that.
Again, if people wanted to support you in not only prayer, but I know that you had perhaps the best third quarter of any Republican candidate, mention your website. Of course, we have the website for the book, which again is something I really do commend to individuals. 240 pages of great material. And that link that we already have up there is bencarsonbook.com. You can get an excerpt of it, and you can find out where various events are. And I know you've taken a break from the campaign to promote the book, but if people are interested in your campaign, where would you like to send them?
It's real easy, bencarson.com. You can find out what's going on and what our positions are and all kinds of things on that page.
And I've been really impressed by all the things that have seemed to come your way. Of course, we mentioned getting first on the ballot and everything from the Virgin Islands to Alabama. And again, you have the 56 jurisdiction strategy so that you would actually be on the ballot in all 50 states plus the 6 U.S. territories. Of course, fundraising. And I know that you and Donald Trump right now are committed to trying to change this upcoming debate on CNBC. What can we do to pray about that, or what's going on in terms of that discussion?
Well, they've agreed to the terms, so that's a done deal. It will only be 2 hours, and we will have an opportunity to make opening statements, closing statements. So, that's reasonable, and that's similar to what the debate schedules have demonstrated, in past years. And it's only been this year that we've metastasized into this 3 hours, and no, you don't get to say anything other than answer our questions. I mean, why all of a sudden do we go to that?
Well, I'm just glad you stood up for it. I'm glad that you and Donald Trump stood up for it, because even those of us that are kind of policy wonks and love to watch these after 3 hours, of course, the 3 hours of the Democratic one was really taxing a lot of our patience. But again, it just is a format that doesn't give us a chance to get to know the various candidates. So we obviously wish you well on the campaign trail, and again, wish you well on another obviously going to be best-selling book by Ben Carson. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It's been delightful.
We will take a break and come back tomorrow to get into some other issues, but I wanted to give you a chance to hear from Dr. Ben Carson. He's been on the program with us many times before, taking a short break, if you will, from the campaign to talk about his new book. And again, if you want to learn a little bit more about the Constitution, there it is, 240 pages. And I think all of us need a refresher course on what the Constitution is and why we need to understand it. So again, that is available. And we have a connection on our website, pointofview.net, or you can go directly to, it's called bencarsonbook.com. You can get an excerpt so you can read a little bit of it before you get the book. And, of course, there's a way in which you can order it and get it either in hardback or on Kindle. That's all we have for today. We have a lot more to cover, but we're out of time. So I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We will take a break and see you back here tomorrow.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 855-87-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 855-87-BIBLE. That's 855-87-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.